The American Prisoners of the Reich, life inside Germany's hidden POW camps. They had flown high above Europe, young men with the weight of nations on their shoulders, their bombers heavy with steel and fire. From England to the Ruhr, from Italy to Berlin, the air war raged without mercy. They were barely out of their teens, pilots, navigators, gunners, trained to precision, but never truly prepared for the moment when the flak tore through the fuselage and the sky itself seemed to fall apart. For many of them, capture was not the end of their war, it was the beginning of a different kind of battle, the struggle to survive inside the hidden prison camps of Nazi Germany. The world of a captured airman began the instant his parachute opened. Thousands of feet below, the ground rushed up, a patchwork of forests, fields, and villages that could mean either safety or imprisonment. Some landed in the hands of farmers or children, bewildered and afraid. Others were less fortunate, descending into the arms of armed civilians or soldiers who saw not a man, but an enemy. The first hours were chaos. Stripped of weapons, watches, and dignity, they were marched through jeering crowds, their flight jackets torn as souvenirs. Many would later recall this moment as the most terrifying of their lives, not because of what awaited them in the camps, but because the rage of a war-torn populace could be immediate and deadly. Interrogation came quickly. The Luftwaffe's intelligence officers were efficient and often disturbingly polite, offering cigarettes and coffee in well-lit rooms while probing for information. The Geneva Convention permitted basic questioning, name, rank, and serial number. But the Germans were masters of conversation, coaxing details through casual talk. Maps on the walls, rumors of comrades captured, and hints of kindness all served to extract slivers of intelligence that, when pieced together, revealed far more than any prisoner intended. Most airmen resisted, repeating their rehearsed lines until exhaustion set in. Some were threatened to be handed over to the Gestapo. For the unlucky few accused of espionage or sabotage, that threat became reality. Eventually, those deemed regular POWs were sent to permanent camps, known as Stalags or Oflags, scattered across the Reich. For airmen, the most infamous was Stalag Luft III near Sagan, today Jagen, Poland. It was a purpose-built camp run by the Luftwaffe, designed to hold Allied Air Force officers. Wooden huts surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and floodlights made escape seem impossible. Yet within these fences, a strange and complex society emerged, one not based on fear alone, but on ingenuity, solidarity, and an unyielding will to return home. At Stalag Luft III, the Germans prided themselves on maintaining quote-unquote civilized conditions. Compared to concentration camps or Gestapo prisons, it was a different world. No summary executions, no gas chambers, but still a place of deprivation, hunger, and psychological strain. Each hut held around 200 men, cramped into bunks with a small stove and limited rations. Food parcels from the Red Cross, cans of Spam, powdered milk, chocolate, and cigarettes became currency in an underground economy that could rival any black market. Men bartered with care packages, traded coffee for soap, or hoarded chocolate to celebrate birthdays or the rare good news from home. Daily life revolved around routine. Roll call, or appel, came at dawn and dusk. The guards stood outside, rain or snow, while counting heads. Any discrepancy meant hours in the cold until the numbers matched. Some guards were harsh and humorless, others quietly sympathetic. Over time, prisoners learned who could be trusted to look the other way and who would not hesitate to shoot. To keep their minds sharp, prisoners organized lectures, theater productions, and even university courses using smuggled textbooks and donated materials. There were classes in languages, history, engineering, and mathematics. They built radios from scrap metal and hidden wires, using the faint BBC signals to gather news from the outside world. The Germans suspected this, of course, and searches were frequent, but the ingenuity of the prisoners often outpaced their captors. Yet beneath this surface of fragile normalcy, escape was a constant obsession. The men at Stalag Luft III were trained airmen, resourceful, mechanical, and accustomed to solving problems under pressure. From the earliest days, they plotted ways to break free. Tunneling became an art form, requiring engineering skill, secrecy, and nerve. Sand had to be hidden, shoring built from bedboards, and ventilation crafted from tin cans and discarded tubing. The Germans used seismographs and guard patrols to detect digging, but the prisoners adapted, digging deeper and hiding entrances beneath stoves, toilets, and floorboards. The most famous of these efforts was the Great Escape of March 1944. It began with 3 tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry, dug simultaneously to confuse the guards. Hundreds of men worked in shifts for months, constructing elaborate underground systems complete with lighting, rail carts, and air pumps. The logistics were staggering: forged documents, civilian clothing, fake passes, and compasses made from melted phonograph needles. When the night of the escape came, 76 men crawled through the tunnel and slipped into the freezing night. They scattered into the forests and fields, heading for the neutral borders of Sweden and Switzerland. But freedom was fleeting. Most were caught within days. 50 were executed on Hitler's personal orders, a brutal message that reverberated through every camp in the Reich. The survivors of Stalag Luft III never forgot the loss. One airman later wrote, "We dug for freedom, but we found the measure of our brotherhood instead." Life inside the camps continued under an uneasy rhythm. As the war dragged on and Germany's fortunes waned, food became scarcer, conditions deteriorated, and the mood darkened. The once efficient Luftwaffe guards were replaced by older men or wounded veterans. Supplies dwindled, heating failed, and winters turned brutal. Still, the spirit of defiance persisted. Men composed music, wrote plays, painted murals, and created small newspapers chronicling daily life. Humor became a weapon, a way to preserve sanity in an environment designed to break it. Among the prisoners were men who found unexpected friendships with their captors. Some guards, disillusioned by the Nazi regime, treated prisoners with decency, even risking punishment to share news or smuggle letters. One American recalled a guard who slipped him bread during a hunger period, whispering, "For your mother, if she were hungry." Small gestures like these blurred the sharp lines of propaganda, revealing the humanity that war sought to erase. Not all camps were as civilized. In smaller, less regulated facilities, conditions bordered on inhumane. Some prisoners were subjected to forced marches between camps as Allied forces advanced. These death marches, carried out in the bitter cold of winter 1945, claimed thousands of lives. Starving, frostbitten, and sick, men trudged hundreds of miles with little food or shelter, collapsing by the roadside. Those who survived remembered it as the final ordeal, a test of endurance that overshadowed even the fear of bombs and bullets. By the spring of 1945, as Allied armies pushed into Germany, the system of camps began to collapse. Guards fled, leaving prisoners to fend for themselves. In some places, German civilians opened the gates. In others, local SS units massacred inmates before retreating. Liberation came in flashes of disbelief. American tanks rolling through barbed wire fences, soldiers embracing, men weeping openly for the first time in years. For many, freedom felt unreal, a dream long postponed. But even liberation carried complexities. The returning POWs were hailed as heroes, yet they carried invisible scars, trauma, malnutrition, and the lingering guilt of survival. Some never spoke of their imprisonment. Others wrote diaries and memoirs that surfaced decades later, revealing the depth of what they endured and the humanity they found in captivity. One such diary belonged to a navigator named James "Jimmy" Carter, not the future president, but a 22-year-old from Ohio whose B-17 was shot down over Hanover. Captured in 1943, he spent 2 years in Stalag Luft I. His writings, discovered by his family long after his death, described both suffering and resilience. They could cage our bodies, but not our hope. Every joke, every shared scrap of food, and every whispered plan was a victory, he wrote. His words echo the unbroken spirit of thousands of men who lived that same story. It began, as so many stories of war do, not on the ground, but in the sky. By the spring of 1943, the air over Europe had become a crucible of fire and fear. The United States Army Air Forces had joined the British RAF in relentless bombing campaigns over Germany, daylight raids meant to cripple the Nazi war machine, to burn away its factories, its railways, its resolve. The men who flew these missions were young, some barely out of school, yet they carried the weight of strategy and vengeance on their shoulders. They were told the missions would be swift: fly in, drop the payload, return home. But the truth of the air war was far different. The Luftwaffe ruled the skies with deadly precision, and anti-aircraft fire could rip an aircraft apart in seconds. Every mission felt like gambling with fate, and more than 1 in 4 airmen never came back. Among those who survived the chaos only to face another kind of battle were the men who found themselves floating down from burning skies, their parachutes blooming like ghosts above enemy fields. They were the American prisoners of the Reich, the airmen who had looked down on Germany from miles above and now faced it up close as captives. The descent was always surreal. For many, it happened so quickly that the brain refused to process what the eyes were seeing. The smoke curling from the wing, the rush of cold wind, the flash of tracer fire. One moment they were part of a machine of war, the next they were falling through silence, waiting for the ground to rush up and decide whether they would live or die. Some landed in fields where farmers stared at them with a mix of anger and fear. Others crashed into forests where they were hunted by soldiers, police, even civilians. For those who survived capture, the first thing they learned was that the Reich had a system, cold, efficient, and vast. Officers went to offlogs, enlisted men to stalags, and captured airmen often ended up in Stalag Lufts, camps run by the Luftwaffe, designed specifically for flyers. The Germans prided themselves on following the Geneva Convention, at least on paper, but paper could not shield a man from hunger, loneliness, or the bitter German winter. The journey to the camps was a nightmare in itself. Prisoners were herded onto cattle cars, 50, 60 men crammed into spaces meant for 20. The smell of sweat, urine, and fear hung thick in the air. Through cracks in the wooden slats, they could glimpse the landscape of a country they had bombed but never known. Quiet villages, frozen rivers, smoke still rising from distant ruins. Sometimes locals gathered by the tracks to curse them, to throw stones or spit. Other times children simply stared, wide-eyed at the men in foreign uniforms passing like ghosts through their homeland. At last the trains would halt in remote areas, far from cities, where the gray shapes of the camps appeared through the mist, rows of barbed wire fences, guard towers, and long wooden huts. The air smelled of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. Dogs barked, guards shouted. And just like that, the airmen who once measured their world in miles of sky now measured it in meters of mud and wire. For many, the first day of imprisonment was the hardest. The loss of freedom hit like a physical blow. One moment you're part of a proud crew, trained to fight, trusted with engines worth fortunes. The next you're a number on a list, ordered to strip, searched, the loused and marched to a barracks where straw serves as your bed. The Germans confiscated everything: watches, rings, photographs, even boots if they looked better than standard issue. The prisoners joked that the guards could strip paint from a wall if they thought it could be traded for cigarettes. But within days, the men began to build their own form of order. The camps became small, strange societies. Senior officers organized committees assigning duties: cooking, sanitation, education, morale. Red Cross parcels began to arrive bringing lifelines of canned food, chocolate, and cigarettes. Those cigarettes became a currency more valuable than money. A man could trade 2 for a tin of milk, 5 for a pair of socks, 10 for a night's peace from hunger. It was a fragile ecosystem, dependent on cooperation and shared discipline. Those who hoarded or stole were quickly ostracized. The men called it camp justice, and it was often more efficient than anything the guards could enforce.
They had no weapons, but they had unity, and that unity kept them alive. Every camp had its characters: the joker, the cynic, the philosopher, the dreamer. In one compound at Stalag Luft I, an American pilot named Tex Callahan became famous for his impressions of the guards. He could mimic their accents perfectly, reducing the barracks to laughter even as frost crept through the walls. Laughter, they said, was a kind of rebellion. Another man, Professor Haynes, an engineer before the war, organized classes in mathematics and navigation. Dozens of men earned what they jokingly called camp degrees, believing that someday, after the war, they'd make something of themselves again. And then there were the artists. With nothing but charcoal and scraps of cardboard, they drew portraits of their comrades, sketches of home, even caricatures of the guards. One artist, Lieutenant Carl Mercer, drew a mural of an open sky above his bunk, a crude but beautiful reminder of what freedom looked like. When a guard saw it and sneered, Mercer simply said, "You can lock the man, not the sky." The guards themselves varied from cruel to indifferent to surprisingly human. Some were veterans from the Great War, weary of fighting and resigned to their duty. Others were fanatics, quick to punish even minor infractions. The Luftwaffe officers, though stern, often treated the airmen with a professional respect. They recognized in the captured Americans reflections of themselves, men who had flown, fought, and fallen. In rare moments, mutual recognition replaced hatred. Still, life in the camps was a test of endurance. Rations were meager: watery soup, a crust of bread, sometimes a sliver of sausage. Red Cross parcels filled the gaps, but they were never guaranteed. When the railways were bombed, supplies failed to arrive, and hunger became a constant companion. Men grew thin, their uniforms hanging loose on their bodies. The cold was relentless, seeping into bones, making every movement an effort. Yet even as bodies weakened, minds refused to surrender. They found ways to resist, subtle, clever, and dangerous. They built secret radios from scavenged parts, hidden in false walls or hollowed-out table legs. Through them, they caught fragments of BBC broadcasts, the only true news from the outside world. Each night, a small group would huddle around one of these hidden sets, whispering updates to others by morning. That whispering was their heartbeat, proof that the Allies still advanced, that home was not just a memory. They also plotted escapes. It wasn't about actually getting out most of the time. It was about proving they could. Each tunnel, each plan was a declaration of spirit. The Germans countered with constant inspections, dogs, and spotlights, but still the digging continued. In one famous instance, a group at Stalag Luft III used bedboards, powdered milk tins, and stolen electrical wire to create an entire underground network. Though most were recaptured after the Great Escape, the courage behind it inspired every prisoner across the Reich. Some escapes were simpler but no less daring. One American airman disguised himself as a German officer using a uniform sewn from stolen fabric. He almost made it to a nearby train before being caught. Another slipped away during a work detail, hiding for weeks in barns, moving only at night. He was recaptured only miles from the Swiss border. Each failure carried risk, not just for the escapee but for those left behind who often faced reprisals. Despite the constant threat, these acts of defiance kept hope alive. Even the smallest victory, a stolen tool, a secret message sent home, was celebrated like a battle won. And for many, it wasn't just about survival, it was about dignity. They also found companionship in unlikely forms. The camp dogs, half-starved and wary, became mascots. Birds that nested on the barracks roofs were fed crumbs and treated as omens of good luck. The men carved chess sets, made playing cards from cardboard, even built makeshift guitars. They celebrated birthdays, Christmas, even staged mock baseball games with sticks and paper balls. In captivity, imagination became both weapon and refuge. As months turned to years, the men changed. The sharp defiance of early imprisonment softened into quiet endurance. Faces grew hollow, laughter slower, but something inside remained unbroken. They began to measure time not by days, but by Red Cross parcels, by rumors, by the shifting sounds of war echoing in the distance. The world beyond the wire was changing, and though they couldn't see it, they could feel it, like a coming storm.
As 1944 dawned, the mood inside the camps shifted. Something had changed in the air, an invisible tremor that rippled through the barbed wire and watchtowers. Rumors began to spread like whispers carried on the wind. The Allies were advancing, Italy had fallen, and the Soviets were pushing west. No one knew what to believe, but hope, once a fragile ember, began to glow again. It was dangerous, that kind of hope. It made men reckless. It made them dream. Some began to plan escapes, not just as gestures of defiance, but as real attempts at freedom. Maps were drawn from memory, compasses built from melted razor blades, German phrases practiced under blankets. Among those men was Sergeant William "Bill" Anders, a navigator from Ohio. Shot down over Bremen, he had spent nearly a year at Stalag Luft IV. Bill had a quiet intensity that drew others to him, an instinct for direction, both literal and moral. He became one of the leaders of a new escape plan, not through force, but through calm conviction. Their goal was simple: dig, reach the woods, move at night, and head toward Poland, where they believed the advancing Soviets might help them. But nothing in the camps was simple. Every board removed, every grain of sand shifted, risked discovery. They dug for months beneath the barracks, using stolen spoons, bits of metal in their bare hands. The earth was frozen and cruel, but the rhythm of the work became its own kind of prayer. At night, they whispered of home. Bill spoke of his father's farm and the smell of wheat in summer. Another man, O'Leary, told stories of Chicago diners and music halls. In those dark, cramped tunnels, the men shared fragments of the world they had lost, as if speaking it aloud could make it real again. But the war outside was closing in. In early 1944, the Allies bombed cities deep inside Germany. Sometimes the men could hear the distant rumble of explosions, and they would cheer quietly, even as the guards shouted for silence. One night, the guards themselves seemed shaken. Their radio crackled with frantic German voices, and for the first time, the prisoners realized that fear was no longer theirs alone. Then, a bitter February morning, the escape plan was betrayed. The guards stormed the barracks, overturning bunks, dragging men into the yard. Someone had talked. The tunnel was discovered, the entrance smashed, and the ringleaders beaten. Bill Anders stood among them, his lip bleeding, his hands bound. He refused to speak. The guards shouted, demanding names, but he stayed silent, staring at the snow. That day, punishment came swiftly. The rations were cut, the Red Cross parcels withheld, roll calls doubled. But the men didn't break. They whispered Bill's name like a promise, and within days others began digging again. Different hut, new tunnel, same dream. Because the thing about captivity was that once you stopped believing in escape, you stopped being human. Still, not every battle was fought with shovels. Many were fought within. The monotony of days, the ache of hunger, the silence after letters stopped coming. These were the real enemies. Depression was common. Some men retreated into themselves, barely speaking. Others found solace in faith or in ritual. The camp chaplains became the quiet healers of that broken world. They held services in secret, whispering prayers that transcended denominations. When the guards banned gatherings, the men simply stood by their bunks, heads bowed, listening to one another's breathe. In that sound, they found communion. One night, snow fell so thick that the guard towers disappeared into white. The men watched from their windows as flakes swirled over the fences. For a moment, the wire looked like lace, the towers like lonely trees. "Even the war can't stop winter," someone murmured. It was the kind of line that stuck with a man, something to repeat when the nights felt endless. There were moments of absurdity, too, tiny rebellions disguised as humor. A group of airmen formed a makeshift theater troupe, staging plays using costumes from blankets and curtains. They performed comedies, even parodies of the German guards. One night, they staged Snow White, with a 6-foot-tall bombardier as the princess and a wiry gunner as the wicked queen. Even some guards couldn't hide their laughter. Laughter was oxygen. It kept the darkness from swallowing them whole. By mid-1944, the Red Cross parcels grew irregular. Germany's rail system was collapsing under Allied bombing. Food became scarce, even for the guards. The men began to trade with local farmers through sympathetic guards. Soap, cigarettes, or chocolate for potatoes or bread. Occasionally, compassion broke through the propaganda. A guard might slip an extra loaf into the kitchen, muttering something about his own son on the front. But compassion had limits. When the Gestapo visited, the atmosphere froze. Everyone knew what they represented: control, fear, the silent threat of execution. The Luftwaffe guards might have respected the Geneva Convention, but the Gestapo did not. One American who mocked a Nazi officer was taken away in a black car. He never returned. His empty bunk remained untouched, a silent reminder of the thin line between survival and disappearance. In August 1944, the Allies broke through in France. The BBC whispers confirmed it. Paris was liberated. The camp erupted in cautious celebration. Men cried, embraced, sang the Star-Spangled Banner under their breath. But with hope came anxiety. What would happen when Germany began to lose? No one trusted the regime to surrender gracefully. Winter came again, the coldest yet. The camps turned to ice. Frost coated the inside of the barracks, and men woke to find their blankets stiff with rime. Some burned bits of their beds to keep warm. Hunger became savage. There were stories of men trading their last cigarette for a crust of bread, or fighting over scraps in the kitchen barrel. Through it all, the bonds between prisoners deepened. Bill Anders, though weakened, became a symbol of endurance. He kept a small notebook hidden under his mattress, writing each day the weather, the rumors, the names of the dead. He called it his logbook of captivity. Later historians would find it among the liberated archives, its pages stained but legible, a testament not just to one man, but to all who endured behind the wire. As 1945 approached, the front lines drew closer. The sound of artillery grew faintly audible on certain nights, a low rumble that made the guards nervous. Prisoners began to sense that the end was near. But endings in war were rarely merciful.
It began in snow, and it did not stop. Thousands of prisoners were driven from the camps, forced to march westward through the heart of a collapsing Reich. They carried what little they owned: blankets, tin cups, the fading strength of their will. Guards marched alongside them, equally afraid, equally hungry. The route stretched for hundreds of miles. Temperatures fell below freezing. Food was almost non-existent. Men collapsed in ditches, frozen or feverish. Those who lagged behind were beaten, sometimes shot. Yet even in that misery, humanity flickered. Prisoners shared crusts of bread, lifted one another when legs failed, whispered jokes through chattering teeth. Bill Anders kept his logbook, even then. His handwriting wavered but continued. January 25th, one entry read, "We walked 30 miles. 2 men fell. I carried O'Leary's pack until sundown. Heard cannon to the east." Each line was a victory over despair. Villagers watched them pass, some sympathetic, others hostile. A few brave souls threw apples or bread into the road when the guards weren't looking. Others cursed the prisoners, shouting "Terrorflieger," "Terror flyers," blaming them for the bombings that had destroyed their towns. The march lasted weeks. Feet bled, frostbite set in, men hallucinated from exhaustion, but still they walked. Some guards, recognizing the futility, softened.
One even handed his rifle to a prisoner, saying, "If you run, shoot me first." None did. The prisoners had no strength left for vengeance. Finally, after more than 600 miles, they reached new camps, deeper in Germany. By then, spring was near, and so was the end. The air raids had become constant. The guards huddled in fear as the skies thundered with Allied bombers. Once, the prisoners themselves narrowly escaped death when a nearby town was obliterated in a raid. They looked up at the contrails and wondered if their own comrades were up there, unaware that their bombs fell near fellow Americans. In those final months, order unraveled. Guards deserted, food vanished, and chaos seeped through the wire. The men stopped pretending to count the days. Some prayed, others simply stared at the horizon. Then one morning in April 1945, it ended. The guards were gone, the towers empty. From beyond the road came the sound of engines, shouts in English, and the sight of tanks with white stars. The Americans had arrived. Men stumbled from their huts, gaunt, trembling, many in tears. They hugged the soldiers, laughed, shouted, or simply collapsed in relief. Bill Anders stood among them, his notebook clutched to his chest. He handed it to a medic and said, "Make sure someone remembers."
Freedom, after so long, felt unreal. The liberated men were sent to hospitals, given food, clothes, and care. But recovery was slow. Their bodies healed faster than their minds. Many suffered from nightmares, sudden panic, or guilt. Why had they survived when others hadn't? Bill Anders returned home that summer. He weighed barely 100 pounds. His mother cried when she saw him. For weeks, he couldn't sleep indoors. The silence felt too heavy without the sounds of guards and footsteps. He kept his logbook beside him, sometimes reading it aloud as if to remind himself it had really happened. Others rebuilt their lives in different ways. Some went back to flying. Some never flew again. A few wrote memoirs, others stayed silent. But the bond between them never faded. They gathered in reunions, shared photographs, remembered the ones who hadn't come home. Historians would later call them the airmen behind barbed wire. Their diaries, drawings, and letters revealed not just suffering, but resilience, the quiet heroism of men who fought without guns. Decades later, when one of the last surviving POWs was asked what he remembered most, he said, "Not the hunger, not the cold, the faces, the laughter we made in hell." And in that simple truth lies the legacy of the American prisoners of the Reich, not as victims, but as proof of the strength of the human spirit, even when the world itself seems to have lost its soul.